All right, we are live, and it looks like you aren't frozen anymore.
Moving. Yay!
We can start over again. So,
Cheers.
Greetings from the fifth dimension. Welcome to Happy Dance's Guide to the Revolution. Thank you so much for joining me, Ellen Genovese. I'm super excited to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I'm really excited that this all transpired. Kind of wild because we haven't really connected since 2008.
It's been a long time, and this
Yeah.
has been one of the major benefits of having this podcast is being able to connect with people that used to be really good close friends of mine that I've kind of fallen out of contact with, and kind of like reconnecting and like seeing what people have been up to and like what we just kind of talking through some interesting stuff. So
Absolutely.
welcome to the list of very the list of guests is growing now. This is podcast number 19, so you're my 19th.
Wow. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Wow. Maybe I should get the lottery ticket or something. This is the lucky number.
Is 19
Well, actually, it's 18, but that's okay. It's close enough.
Yeah. That's awesome. So where I usually like to start these podcast episodes is just kind of talking about where we know each other from. I think it just kind of sets the stage from like kind of the history, So we went to North Pocono together. I graduated in 2008 with your brother, Chris. So shout out to Chris. I hope he watches this episode and I hope he enjoys it. He comes up a couple times here, so stay tuned, Chris. We're going to be talking. And we were in journalism together, correct? And that was a lot of fun. And obviously what I'm doing here is like sort of like journalism. It's not exactly journalism, but it's media. It's content creation. So it's exploring ideas, and there's often a lot of writing that comes with it, or writing that comes after it, or writing that goes into preparing for it. So it's all kind of put it together. And were you 2 years younger than me? Were you 2010?
Yes, I was 2010.
Right. Yeah. And, your brother and I were pretty close, good friend of mine, friends with Chrissy Scannon, and, played football together. And, butted heads sometimes. Like, we were friends, but, like, we weren't always on the same page and stuff.
Oh, man. And Chris, he's like, we always said he'd be a great lawyer because he just argues and he wins his arguments.
He's a tough kid, too, and you got to respect that. So I have some good stuff lined up for us here today, and I'm looking forward to kind of getting into all that. But one of the kind of like after we talk about how we know each other, one of the next things I like to do is kind of prompt you with a question that's ultimately like the theme of this podcast and the Declaration of Interdependence is like what grand changes would you like to see to our current government, or like, what do you wish was different? What kind of frustrates you with how things work currently, and what would you like to see changed, if anything?
Yeah. Well, for starters, I read your post on Facebook, the 5 things that you hate about Trump?
Which I promptly adjusted the question into parameters that were
gotcha.
Feel like more appropriate, because hate is, and we're going to get into hate. We're going to get into that a little bit, but anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. The one component that stuck out to me, you said that you are interested in a political party or a politician that is just freely invested and interested in, the environment. Yes. That is so crucial, if we're the most intelligent species, then why aren't we maintaining and cultivating our planet? We are killing our species, not just extinction of, animals, which is all over science, but look at the diseases that we have as human beings that weren't rampant 20, 30, 40 years ago. Yeah. It's, if you're more science-based, the evidence is there.
Yes.
It's wild.
Yes.
So I definitely agree with you there that we need a political party that is, like you said, we should be the driving force of, you know, a better policy when it comes to our environment. And it's like, what in the world are we doing?
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
So that's definitely one thing.
Right.
I would definitely also, I don't want this to come across as one-dimensional, but I want to see more women in leadership.
Totally.
You know, there's so much there, not just for, you know, the sake of equality or, but having, as a woman, it matters to me because it's, you know, it's a fact. Like, what is it? Men are from Mars and women are from Venus or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, our brains work differently. That's scientifically proven. We need a better representation in these things, you know, and I don't want to go into like whole pro-life, pro-choice type of thing, but I am pro-choice.
Mm-hmm.
And that really surprises a lot of people, but that's basic healthcare. In my understanding, my interpretation, it's basic healthcare. And the fact that like all these men that are state representatives and like, I just shake my head because I was talking to my friend the one day and I said, having that underrepresentation makes me feel like I don't matter, you know? So it's very, very difficult in that sense. So definitely, you know, when it comes to the environment, having more women in, you know, different, I guess, leadership roles.
Yeah, totally.
Definitely those two things that are coming off the top of my mind right now.
Yeah, so let me kind of build off some of those. So the first piece within the environment.
Mm-hmm.
So I think oftentimes we get stuck in specifics, like arguing about the specifics, and really like where disagreements are happening is like deeper than that, you know? So
always.
For example, the question I think we have to ask ourselves is like, what is the role of government?
Yeah.
What do we want them to do?
Yeah.
And for me, I think one of their primary responsibilities, I think, should be protecting the commons, the environment, the air, the water, the future, sustainability. Like they should be, I believe this, that it's their responsibility to implement policy to protect those things.
Yeah.
You know? So if someone doesn't believe that, they don't think that that's their responsibility, then like that's where the disagreement is, you know?
Yeah.
Stuck in like specific regulations about like, oh, like I don't want the government interfering in my right to do business. And it's like, okay, let's back, you know?
Yeah.
Do you not think they should be doing this at all? You know? And I do. I firmly believe that. The reason I believe that is because if you look at the incentive for an individual,
exactly,
it's just not there. Like it's like some company could dump pollution into the ocean because it's cheaper and they can profit and they don't have to deal with the waste. And like everybody has to deal with the waste. So like they get all the benefit and they share in the negative externalities of their, you know?
Absolutely.
And you can look at that on a small scale too, like littering, you know, like especially if you have to pay for your waste to be disposed. Like it's easier to just throw all your trash out the window or just dump it in your neighbor's property. But instead we create laws to prevent that from happening because we have come to an agreement through a democratic process that that's the government's role to protect those things. You know?
Yeah. And also, I have a friend that lives in New York, like New York State, and for them to have more of an incentive to recycle their plastic, I'm not sure if they're glasses, but if you go to Walmart and you buy 2 liters of Coca-Cola, that's, you know, an extra 20 cents that you're being charged, but then you get that 20 cents back when you return those plastic bottles to these designated, you know, receptacles. And it's so frustrating that why can't, as a nation, we come together to implement these different policies? Like when I was in Japan, I lived there for 3 months. And I did a study abroad, I think my senior year.
Mm-hmm.
Over there, they had designated trash bags. They're color coded and everything so that you know what trash gets sorted out to what. And if I remember correctly, first of all, you have to do it, or you could get fined. And if you don't do it correctly, I know there's other repercussions. But when I was over there, that was one thing that stood out to me. Like, they're doing something right. Like, why can't we all learn from each other and implement what is best for the environment? Like, why is that so hard?
Yeah.
Because there isn't a profit. That's why.
Right. So instead, we have to create an incentive structure that's outside of like strictly capitalism.
Exactly.
Whether that's putting a charge on your disposable containers, like a 10 cents, 5 cents charge, and then you can kind of redeem those. Like I think that's a pretty good policy, and if that was, like you said, implemented at a wider across all the states, then that would be, I think, to ultimate benefit, and then the other thing you brought up, I think, is important too, is getting more women in leadership. And I do think that's important too. And even for me, I've been trying to bring more women onto the podcast because I feel like, first of all, I think that some of my best episodes have been with young women.
How about that?
I think that they have different things to say than young men, and I want to be able to hear those things and be able to give those things a platform, and kind of backing up further, like you're saying that like women bring a different perspective, and I agree, but I also think that men and women are more alike than they are different, but they are different, and you have to also understand statistics a little bit to like really understand like how are those differences measured, so like you have like at the extremes, it's more noticeable, so like, for example, men tend to be like more aggressive and more hostile even, and that's why when you look at the extremes, there's more men in prison. Because they're more willing to do those aggressive, risky behaviors for the reward, and what I think the benefit is getting women in leadership roles and getting women in politics is essentially like what I kind of call the divine feminine, having the divine feminine be part of our policy making, So like, I guess what I mean by that is like, if you look historically or even prehistorically, men generally speaking were responsible for production.
Yeah, they were the hunters.
Right. And women were responsible for distribution. And that's sort of the same problem that we're having with politics today, is that's hyper focused on production, like fighting for rising to the top, and where the divine feminine comes in is like, okay, that's all well and good, but we still have to worry about distributing this across and making sure that everyone has enough. And the people that can't do as much or are disabled in some way or whatever, that we don't like leave them behind or completely ignore them, because they're part of our society.
As you're talking, that really made me think about my career in social work. I don't know the statistics myself, but just from what I saw, there are so many more women in that field than men. And from what you're describing, that makes sense. And I think it goes, depending if you're more faith-based, it's how men and women were created. If, women were created with more nurturing capabilities and things like that. So it makes sense why we would be more concerned with like the distribution, like you were saying.
There's more compassion, more empathy, and I think it's biologically driven, like a woman has to be able to deal with like a crying infant who can't take care of themselves, and they have to like sacrifice themselves to take care of that infant, to give,
right.
And that's built into them, and like men have this other thing built into them that's like, if I don't stand out above my peers, then I won't get a mate. I won't be successful. I
You
won't.
got to be that rooster that puffs your chest out.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there's more of an incentive to like take those risks as a man to like climb, because there's more risk, but there's also more reward, you know?
How about that? Yeah.
Like, yeah. And I think these are in our stories too. I mean, we're going to talk about religion and religious stories and stuff too, but I think like some of it is embedded in the stories. Like talk about like the story of like St. George and the Dragon. I don't know if you're familiar with that story at all, but if you're familiar with Harry Potter, it's basically the second Harry Potter book. It's the same story, you know, and J.K. Rowling was kind enough to modernize it for us.
There you go. Okay.
But it's being willing to go out into the dangerous world and like fight the dragon of chaos, and there's like rewards for that, you know. And ultimately, what he does is he does that, and what does he get as a reward? He gets Ginny. He saves Ginny, the virgin, you know.
Okay.
So there's like rewards for being courageous and like putting yourself in danger for the ultimate good, you know.
Right. You bring up an interesting argument though, because it's like why is it in human nature that we have to work off of incentives or rewards? Like, why can't we just come together because we know it's for the common good, you know? Like, you know, oh man, I mean, the world already does act off of incentives and rewards and things like that, but just like that's why I think a lot of communal living facilities and like a lot of just communities are kind of popping up because people are realizing like something's not working. Right. And they're going back to kind of like you were saying, those primitive you know, like structures.
Yeah,
because
like communities.
Right. Yeah, like what worked there and why did we veer away from it? And
yeah,
wild.
Totally. Because what worked there worked for a really long time, and it certainly wasn't perfect, but that's what led us to where we are today. You know, we evolved in tribes as hunter gatherers, and we spent most of our evolutionary history in that form. You know? So I think we have a lot to learn by looking at that and kind of modeling our societies off of that. You know?
Oh, but you got to be careful because that's communism.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think what the danger is, you kind of almost have to like look at the extremes to understand the danger. Yeah. You know, so like if I were just focused on like getting to the top and like completely neglecting any form of distribution or any form of like sharing of resources, you know, ultimately what would happen is I would become king of the shit pile.
Yeah. Like
I'm at the top, but I'm not the top of something that's not really that great.
Yeah.
You know? And then like the other side of the extreme is like if we just focus on distribution and nobody's like competing to do better, then we don't have anything to distribute, you know? And that's sort of what communism they dealt with in Soviet Russia, you know?
Yeah.
We're so worried about like the people at the top taking advantage of the people at the bottom. They killed all those people and nobody knew how to do anything. Mass starvation, you know?
Right.
So that's not good either, you know? And that's a big theme of this podcast too, is like balance. How do we find balance in these seemingly competing, conflicting forces? How do we bring them into harmony? How do we do masculine and feminine?
Absolutely.
How do we do production and distribution, you know?
Yes. That, man, there's this priest. He's actually a Catholic mystic priest. Where I resonate more with him because he airs on more so like the mystery of God, like the Christian God. And he talks about that balance so much that it's not one or the other. It's not, you know, he's just more about like this, you know, dualistic thinking. And for so many people, they can't handle that. Like people can't handle, you know, just something like the yin and yang, you know?
Yes.
And people need, for some reason, just these black and white types of like instructions to go off of life. And it's like, why? Like, that's not working. You know, why can't I be strong but compassionate?
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
But
exactly. Yeah. And I think part of the reason is it's really tempting to pick a side. And because once you pick a side, everything is simplified.
It's true. Yeah.
It enables you to simplify everything. But the problem is like things aren't simple. Things are complicated and deep and contradictory sometimes and competing. You have to be able to live in that uncomfortable space of sometimes uncertainty.
Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely. Yeah. And a lot of people can't handle that tension point because, well, for one thing, I think this is one of my conspiracies that I believe.
Oh, yeah, let's hear that.
I think that at least in America, they're trying to get rid of, and by they, I mean whoever's really in control.
Sure.
Not the Democrats or Republicans or Donald Trump. I'm talking about like they, who's like in control of them. And they're trying to get rid of or completely absolve critical thinking. Like, I firmly believe that. Like, and that's one thing. If you don't have critical thought, you don't have critical thinking skills, then yes, you're going to go with the flow. Yeah. Look at what we're doing now. Like, I didn't post on social media that I came down to Florida because 99% of social media is, if you're not wearing a face mask, then you know, like, do you even love America?
Right.
How is that even being questioned?
Yeah. Yeah. You frozen her pretty.
Oh my gosh, look at my That's great.
Let's see if that corrects itself, and if not, we can restart.
My gosh.
And I can edit and merge these videos later.
Okay, that's good. I look like that one receptionist from what's that movie, Monsters Inc. It's Mike Wazowski.
So funny. Oh man. Okay, I'm gonna stop it and restart it, and I'll just have to edit and remerge these later. We'll pick up with critical thinking and okay.
Thanks.
Talk to you soon.
Okay.
Okay, we're back. A little technical difficulty there, disconnection. So you were saying that you kind of have this sort of conspiracy theory that the powers that be are trying to like eliminate critical thinking. And if I pick up from there, I would say that it sort of makes sense. I don't know who those people are necessarily, but people are easier to control and manipulate if they're not willing to engage in critical thought.
Yes.
So, it's hard. It's something like that is like hard to prove.
Yeah, definitely.
I think the evidence is sort of there. At least there's like enough to like seem that that's what's going on. You know?
Yeah.
And I think part of it has to do with the two party system that we have. You have to pick one. They kind of force you to pick one. Not really the way to go about things, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Better to live in that space in between, the uncomfortable space in between of uncertainty and nuance and seeing both sides of issues and trying to come with a compromise. You know?
Yeah.
So, okay, let's we talk about religion a little bit.
Sure.
So first, I kind of want to like tell a little story about your brother and I argued back in the day.
Oh my gosh.
And like he and I would argue about everything and anything, and like.
Oh, you too?
Yeah. And you know, when we would argue about religion, it wasn't like super sophisticated, at least like compared to like, you know, where I'm at today, a little bit more like I've kind of grown a lot with it, you know. But basically I would say God's not real and he would say God's real, and we would just go back and forth and just be stupid, you know. And part of it was like just in good fun and like kind of poking at each other, you know. but my beliefs certainly have evolved a lot since then. And I know that you're a religious person and you've studied a little bit. So I kind of want to talk with you about your beliefs, like what value you get from religion and kind of like your upbringing with it and your experience with it overall. I think that's kind of a good place to start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting. When you first asked me to come on the podcast, that like jogged my memory of like us in journalism class. So that's really where we got to know each other.
Yes.
And I would say that's when I was in high school, that's kind of where my spiritual journey started.
Mm-hmm.
And it was funny. Can you hear all that noise in the background?
Only very faintly.
Okay. I didn't want it to mess with like the audio or anything. But I remember in journalism class one time, I don't know how we got started talking about religion. I don't remember, but I just remember you were the first person to ever tell me. You were like, Ellen, when you die, it's lights out. Whoa, lights out.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
But yeah, when I was in high school, that's where like my personal spiritual journey started. You know, I was raised in an Episcopalian church. My dad's side of the family is Catholic. So we just grew up in Christianity. Mm-hmm. And each of those religions have, you know, their own theologies that, you know, make them distinct. But yeah, even looking back, when we had that conversation, I didn't even necessarily have a personal relationship with like God yet. Mm-hmm. It was just more so adopted. Like that's the way of life. Like, especially as a white woman in America, it's mm-hmm. in our nation, like we are one nation under God. But as I've grown and read different things, like that's not true. You know, like that's true for some people, but that doesn't encompass everybody. Like, especially America is just so much bigger than that.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, I got off track there.
Well, did you know that from the Pledge of Allegiance that piece about under God was actually added later?
Yes. I was like, what? Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, people have to do their research. Like, you can't just be spoon-fed information. Like, you can't take things. And man, I don't know if you watched it on Hulu. Man, I forget what it was called. It's this documentary series about Satanists.
Mm-hmm. I haven't watched that.
Yeah, I think it's still on Hulu. Mm-hmm. But that's where I was learning about all of that stuff. Like, mm-hmm. So you're like Satanist. Like, why would you want to watch something about that? Like, even if I were to go to my mom and like, oh, Mom, you have to watch this documentary. Like, it's wild. And she'd just automatically say, I don't want to watch it. It's about Satanists. I'm like, no, it's not. That's just what they call themselves. Yeah. And they explain that in the documentary. But yeah, so my perspective was like Christianity is it's just what is. And my personal journey began in high school, where for like saving time, it was kind of, do you remember what campus life was in high school?
Sort of. It was like a Christian group.
Yeah, kind of. It was, yeah, like a after school type thing. Mm-hmm. It could be equated to like an evangelical church, like youth group.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
So I started going to that, and that's where I developed my personal relationship with God, mm-hmm. and that's where that started. And then I was then graduating high school. During that time, I decided that I wanted to be baptized I shouldn't say that. I wanted to be baptized as a proclamation that I'm choosing Christianity. This is what I'm following. Other religions like Catholicism, that's one of like the holy sacraments. So you would be baptized into the faith. Where so with like evangelical Christianity, it's just symbolic. It's a proclamation. You know, I was baptized in a lake opposed to like holy water or, you know,
Right.
oil that a priest prayed over. You know what I mean? So there's distinct differences there. Because that was where I was at with my journey personally. And then I went to a Christian college. What, wild. Oh man, Jordan. Whew. So
What?
I was just so naive. Like looking back, going into that university, first of all, I had no idea what I was doing. Like, I just thought it was just regular college, like any other college. I didn't go to open house because, like, I knew what I wanted to go to college for. Like, I didn't need a tour. I'll just show up on campus. I'll figure it out. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
So I didn't do the whole, like, open house, blah, 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 like, go see what it's about. None of that. I was on campus my freshman year. I had cigarettes in my purse, and I started finding about like all these rules. Like it was no smoking on campus, blah, blah, blah. Threw my cigarettes away. It was such a strict college that at first I was having issues with it, but I didn't have the foresight to understand like, oh, I could transfer colleges. Like that thought just never crossed my mind. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So this was the type of strict Christian college where if I had a relationship with a guy, I couldn't hold their hand walking to class because we weren't married. And I didn't find this out until like later, but so I went to college the fall of 2010. It wasn't until 2009 that women were allowed to wear jeans to class. And like, I was like, what? And it never crossed my mind to leave the college because it was still close to home. Like every weekend I still worked for my dad at, you know, the restaurant.
I assume you were going to the University of Scranton?
No.
Oh, where were you going?
It is now called Clark Summit University, or maybe it's Summit University or Clark Summit University. It used to be called Baptist Bible College.
Okay.
So.
Got it.
Yeah. So looking back, it was. I mean, I don't regret where I went to college because I don't think people should live their life full of regrets. You should either learn from a negative experience or, you know, try to mend whatever wasn't positive. So, it's still hard for me. Like, I don't want people to know where I went to college just because of, you know, what that could mean to somebody. And that's kind of where I'm at right now with Christianity is it's like, if it's not positive, I don't want to be a part of it, you know, like, and that's so hard because it's not necessarily like, oh, you don't agree. It's not disagreements. It's that people are personally attacked, you know, whether it's because of, you know, their sexual orientation or, you know, whatever. And I don't want to be a part of that. I don't want to be associated with it.
Right.
You know, just like my mom doesn't even want to watch a documentary that's called Satanism or whatever in her living room. She doesn't want to be associated with it.
Right.
So, looking back, I've come to kind of reconcile that because at different points of our lives, we take what we need, right? So, when I was in like high school and college, what I needed was that compassion, that love, that understanding, that unconditional acceptance. And that's what I was taking from that, which is from, you know, that college or Christianity or whatever, because that's what I needed as a person.
Yes.
Now I'm more confident in who I am, and other things. So I'm able to more critically think before diving into something, you know? So, yeah, it was just wild. Like when I was in school, I was friends with this one girl. She had a class and she was, I forget, it was like some women's ministry class. And she was telling me about an assignment, and she told me the assignment was to bake an apple pie. And like, if my energy didn't express what I was feeling, my face definitely did, because she was like, no, not like, you know, if someone comes over your home, you should be hospitable and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, but like, it's just like, do you understand the sexism behind that?
Yeah.
And those things aren't gender roles in a fundamental, and by fundamental, I mean they take the Bible literally. Like what it says is literal. So the world was created in 7 days. It was created in 7 days.
Yeah.
And in those types of religions, like the fundamentalists, gender roles are that black and white as well.
Yeah.
And so for people at that college that have grown up in it, like I was a part of a very small group of people at that college that were like resisting.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean? And we were definitely pinpointed by administration. I almost got fired from being an RA twice, because if I was in a leadership position, I needed to be teaching the right way, which was their way. And I don't say all of this for, you know, people to become disgusted with like that college or that sect of Christianity. That's not my intent.
Right.
You know, my intent is just to describe my experience, because I'm the type of person that believes with whenever there's bad, there has to be good, you know, and just like religion itself. If people are just so like convinced that there's evil, well, then there has to be good somewhere, you know? So that college really does do a lot of good. But for me, I definitely evolved out of that when I realized there was just so much missing, and so many interpretations of scripture or the Bible or a certain aspect of the Bible that I just didn't agree with any longer.
Or whatever, yeah.
So, yeah, that's kind of...
I see. So, a quote that I really like that I got from a TED Talk is, people don't buy what you do. They buy why you do it. And the why ultimately comes down to what you believe. Because that's ultimate, you know, they're connected. Your belief is your why, you know, your decision making. So, you know, what is it now going through that process? Can you like articulate what you believe and like try to explain that to me so I can understand it a little bit?
Yeah. Well, right now, I guess I can't really articulate, like I can't say, oh, I'm a Christian and this is what I believe. Like right now, I'm just more open to other spiritual possibilities. I I want to also pinpoint, like, there is something supernatural. So I've been talking to one of my best friends. She grew up in, the evangelical Baptist faith. We were best friends in college. Like, we have a super tight bond. And we had a conversation recently where she brought up, like, I've noticed a change in you. Like, what's going on? Like, do you believe in God? That type of conversation. And I, like, finally opened up to her because I never really opened that up to her because I didn't want her to just, like, look at me like a project that I had to be converted back into Christianity. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So, but I was like, you know what? We're talking about it. I'll open up to you. And that was really great, for our friendship, but also to hear what she had to say. And, I was just honest with her, like, hey, I'm feeling lost right now. I'm just really overwhelming myself, like, with all these possibilities. Like, why are we so arrogant to say that Christianity is the way when you look at, you look at so many cultures, and it's known that each culture has recognized that there is some higher power, some other, force, whether it's like in Eastern religions or, like in, Native American, like, spiritual world, like, or Greek mythology. We call it mythology, but, like, for some reason they called them gods. So I'm trying to expand my own mind right now. And she kind of came back with a lot of scriptural references, which makes sense. One of them being that, like, Jesus calls himself the way, the truth, and the life. And you can only be you can only be set free through him. And while she was really just laying out all of this, there really was a part of my soul that just, like, felt like it was being fed. That it was kind of like, as I was reading, I was like, I wanted more of it. And that kind of threw me for a loop because, I think everyone needs to find what is true for them. I'm not saying my spiritual experience is going to be the same as yours. But for me to be struggling and for her to lay out this scripture where a lot of Christians, obviously it is like divine, it is holy, it is the scripture. It is, like, at least in some sects of Christianity, it is, divinely inspired, like, written by the Holy Spirit through people, like, through humans.
Right.
So if that's true, and when I had my spiritual experience with God in Christianity, that is when, you're indwelt with the Holy Spirit. So to have that connection, it makes sense. Like, for her to be, like, I haven't opened up my Bible and I haven't done anything, like, in the last year or two because I've just been trying to figure things out.
Right.
And for her to kind of lay out all this scripture, and when I'm reading it, it's like I want more and more, like, you're eating, like, an amazing chocolate cake. Like, you don't want to stop eating it.
Right.
And that kind of made me stop and think, like, it just made me think, like, why was that,
Right. So, I'm trying to think where to take this.
I know it's
maybe. Okay, so when I was preparing for this, I wrote down, what I was going to ask you, what you believe. It prompted me to kind of ask myself what I believe.
Interesting. Yeah.
In order to try to, like, articulate that. So maybe I could try to do that if you're.
Okay. Yeah, I'm interested because my last experience with you was lights out.
So I'll start there, and then I'll back into this other stuff. Like what I'm about to talk about has very little to do with what happens after you die. Like I still have very little, I don't put much weight in that aspect of religion.
Yeah.
Just my personal preference where I'm sitting right now. I don't get a lot out of it, so I don't put a lot into it. And maybe it's related. But anyway, what I believe is that these religious stories, especially the really good ones, the ones that have lasted for thousands of years,
exactly, yeah.
capture within the story, they capture psychological truths. And they put those truths into a dramatic story.
Yeah.
Right. And I believe that the storytelling element is important because when something's in story form, it's easy to understand. It's easy to communicate across time, and it's easy for us to put ourselves in the shoes of the characters.
Yes. Yeah.
So, and I believe that those psychological truths are tools that people have used. They've wielded those tools to great benefit. So, in a sense, that those things are ingrained in our biology and in our social evolution. So, if I can kind of maybe try to give an example of that, like somebody who believes that we need to look out for our neighbors, we need to take care of our family members, we need to try to give back to our community. So let's say everybody in the community believes that, and they believe that, and it's their belief is demonstrated through their action. So they're not just saying it, but they're actually living it and doing it. Well, that community is probably going to prosper. They're probably going to do pretty well. Whereas if there's this other community over here that says, nothing really matters, I'm only in this life for personal pleasure and personal gain, and anybody who's in my way, fuck them.
Yeah.
Like that community is very unlikely to prosper.
Yeah.
So if you look at it as in looking back in time, you can kind of see these psychological truths as they're ingrained in people, benefiting themselves and benefiting their communities.
Absolutely.
So something else I believe is a lot of these stories are true, but they're not true in a literal sense. They're true in condensation of truth.
Yes.
So, for example, you look at the Adam and Eve story. I don't believe that is a literal story, know? But I do believe that there was this awakening of consciousness that occurred in human evolution. Effectively, the discovery of the fourth dimension, the discovery of time.
Yeah.
Discovery that I am not only am I hungry today, I'm going to be hungry tomorrow.
Yes.
My family's going to be hungry tomorrow, and then all of that sort of builds into our character to understanding the importance of sacrifice and self-sacrifice. But it didn't necessarily happen all at once. It was a gradual process as our brains changed and as our societies changed and things became more, So something else that I want to say too is that I don't necessarily identify with a particular religion. You get on these questionnaires identify your religion. I'm I don't know. I'm not picking one,
Right.
But I have begun to embrace religious ideas, especially when they've had psychological value to me.
Yeah.
So, you can talk about Christianity, but you could also talk about ancient Mesopotamian religions or Egyptian religions or the stories in Genesis, or even the Greeks and the Romans and their articulation of what gods were, or Buddhism or Taoism. They all have psychological value to them if you can dig into the stories and look at them as stories and look at them as what can I learn from this story,
Absolutely. Yeah.
Makes sense?
Oh God, yeah.
So
yeah, even what you were saying, there's a part, I forget what gospel is it. Jesus said that he speaks in parables because they're easier to relate to. Even if you think now, I know for myself, I learned so much more personal character development from fictional stories.
Yes.
My top 2 favorite books are The Hobbit and Ghost Set of Watchmen by Harper Lee. And
that one out.
Yeah, it's the sequel, I think, To Kill a Mockingbird, which was actually supposed to be the prequel, but they didn't print it. So then, like, obviously years later, they printed it. But yeah, in high school, I didn't read To Kill a Mockingbird. So at first, I read To Go Set a Watchman, and I loved it. Absolutely loved it. Like, there's just so much about, you know, growing as a person and critical thinking in that book that you can glean from it.
Yes.
But yeah, like, that just, yeah, I mean, obviously, even Jesus said himself, even if you don't, like, it's so hard. I'm just the type of person, I get caught up on convictions. Okay. So when you look at, yeah, like when you look at Christianity, for example, like think of a bullseye. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's say there's only two rings. There's the main ring and then there's the bullseye. Outside, there's women's roles in the church, different doctrines, like, you know, your position on salvation, you know, things like that. The core, the bullseye, is the meat and potatoes. Like, is God loving? Just kind of those like black and white type things. And I have a really good relationship with one professor I met at my college. But he definitely goes against the grain himself. Like, he's been like demoted after demoted after demoted because he wasn't afraid to tell them there are other ways of thinking and believing, you know? And so even years after I graduated, we meet up once in a while, get coffee for like hours. And I like want to shake him because I'm like, there aren't any places for women in the church. And he's just like, he will flat out tell me, he's like, it doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter because at the end of the day, what does that say about my personal relationship with God? You know? Because right now, if I get stuck on that, it's obviously deterring me from moving forward with God, you know? And how is that helping, like you said, the comments? How is that helping you in this conversation right now? How is that going to help the viewers if they're kind of like wondering and thinking, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, actually, I think this is like a real problem with religion is that the heroes in the stories, which I look at them as heroes, and I look at them as hero epics, they're masculine stories of heroic tales.
Yes.
There's not a lot of female heroes in these stories.
Yeah.
So
there's a reason for that too.
Which is
because, well, when you look back historically, Jesus had to be a male. Like, cattle had more value 2,000 years ago than a woman did. Wow. It wasn't legal for women to speak for themselves. Like, actually, I have this book called Jesus Feminist. So I definitely recommend it. Yeah.
Who's the author?
The author is Sarah Bessey, Bessey. It's really short, like super short. It's only like 200 and some pages.
Can you give me some of the main themes or like what you've extracted from it? Or
yeah, she's basically her premise is like, what if Christianity wasn't meant to be patriarchal? Like, I mean, she flat out says Christianity was not meant to be patriarchal. And yeah, one thing she brought up early in the book was, in that time, to speak to a woman, first of all, you'd never addressed a woman like we're doing right now. You would have to address the headship of the household, which was a man.
Her father or her oldest brother or whatever.
Exactly. So First of all, if you consider what Jesus was doing, he was overturning the Jewish religion at that time, completely overturning it. So that made him a target.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine if he was a woman, he would have been killed on the first day. So, you know, like he addressed, and that's what the book is helping me understand is he just looked at everybody equally. And that's a part of scripture too, where it's so unfortunate that, like you said, we always lie on one side or the other. We can't just have this dualistic thinking, which is why I love that one priest I was talking about. His name's Richard Rohr. It's Rohr. But he's all about that dualistic thinking, because you see that throughout the Gospels. Like Jesus, one of the most famous parables was the woman at the well. He's directly speaking to women. He's hanging out with prostitutes, you know, and that's why he was like so crazy, because all just like these cultures, these people, these religious leaders, they were like, what do you think you're doing? And he's like, I'm God. I can do what I want.
Yeah. Well, it's going back to what we talked about before about like picking a side and like how it's a flawed strategy to pick a side. I think that's part of the Jesus story too, is kind of what you're pointing at, is like he could have just gone along with like the Jewish traditions of the time and like not created him a target of himself, you know? Right. He also could have like not stood against the Roman Empire. Yeah. You know, but instead he stood against both of them and put himself in the middle as a target. And because of that, he, you know, was crucified. And but also because of that, he went down in history. Yeah. You know, because if he had picked a side, he wouldn't be a character in the story. He would just be another person to go along with whatever was happening, you know? So I think there's like a message in there to like stand up for what you believe in, and like don't be afraid to like put yourself on the line for like what you believe. And that doesn't mean like be hard-headed and stubborn and not be open to criticism. You know, it's not. It just means like be confident enough to stand on your own, even if no one's standing with you.
Oh, yes. And that is what To Go Set a Watchman's about.
Oh, really?
Yeah. But absolutely, like you look at the Chronicles of Narnia, and that author is C.S. Lewis, and you look at the Lord of the Rings books, the author is J.R.R. Tolkien. Those were two of the greatest theologians of that century.
Yes.
And that, like, you look at those books and you look at the biblical themes in them, and that makes me just think, like, that's why those are magnificent books, and they are to the caliber that they are.
Absolutely. And I'm less familiar with those books, but I'm super familiar with the Harry Potter series, and it's the same sort of idea. Like, J.K. Rowling built into these stories religious themes, and that's why they're so widely popular, because they strike a psychological chord with people.
Exactly.
They're speaking to like truths that are like emotional truths or psychological truths that are trying to guide human behavior in the world, which is ultimately what religion is trying to do, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I want to back up a little bit to your topic about the target, the bullseye thing.
Okay.
Because this is something I learned from, actually a lot of this is something I learned from studying the work of Dr. Jordan Peterson. I don't know if you're familiar with him at all, but certainly something worth checking out. Something he taught me is that, like, the word sin, and it means, I think the Greek translation is hamartia, and it means to miss the mark.
Okay.
So that's like what sin is like anytime you're missing the mark, you know?
Right, yeah.
And there's lots of ways to miss the mark. You can miss the mark because you don't even know there's a target. You can miss the mark because you're not aiming. You can miss the mark because you're aiming in the opposite direction. You can miss the mark because you are aiming, but you're not focused, or you're, you know, there's lots of ways. But the closer we can get to that target, like the less sin ultimately that we have, you know, the more accurate we are. And that's sort of like going back to the Jesus thing. That's kind of what he's saying in some of his words. He's like, I am the way, the truth.
Right.
Like the truth, like an arrow is true. Like when it flies straight and it hits the target, you know, it's like that path of like this very narrow path to walk, you know? And like the closer you get to it, the better off you are for sure, you know?
Right. Yeah. Right. And that's what, so the 10 Commandments, right? A lot of people are like, oh, I'll just follow the 10 Commandments. I won't kill someone, you know. I won't steal anything major, but maybe I'll steal a pack of gum. But like the fact is you're still like stealing. So the only way that you can either like follow the 10 Commandments or that they could either like ring true to you is because of Jesus. And so if you think of it like you're on one side of the bridge and you see the perfection and you see that on the other side, there isn't, I'm sorry, two cliffs. Like there isn't the bridge there yet. But because of Jesus, like he is the way. He made the way for you to have that relationship with God, which will then influence your decision making. So that's why there are some like different sects in Christianity that believe as a human being, you were born sinful. Like you are inherently sinful. So it doesn't matter that you're a good person. You need to proclaim that you have a personal faith with Jesus, that you have been saved through faith in God. But, you know, there are also like a lot of other types of thinking that believe maybe we are actually inherently good, because you look at earlier tribes and they worked together. They didn't have like these concepts of philosophies and everything, but they still worked together and they survived and they cared for one another and maybe they even loved one another, you know, like I think it was like the Greek philosophers that came up with all of these abstract concepts and everything. And so I could get caught up on all of that, like all the what ifs, and that is really overwhelming. But I'm also terrified of like, I don't ever want to be this one-dimensional thinker, you know, like, and it's really overwhelming a lot of the times. Yeah,
definitely. I want to go back to the piece you said about the 10 Commandments, because I think if you look at religion as sort of a progression over time, 10 Commandments came much earlier than Christian theology, right? And even I think the 10 Commandments were sort of extracted from even older pieces from either Egypt or Mesopotamia or whatever, you know? But they're sort of restrictive, like thou shalt not do this, thou shalt not do that. And like there's some utility in having some restrictions, especially when you're trying to guide your own personal behavior in the world, you know? But if you fast forward to like Jesus theology, Christian theology, it's more open-ended. Questions like, what would Jesus do? Because you can apply the question to any scenario. It's not just thou shalt not kill. Like, yeah, okay, you're not going to kill in this scenario, but like, what are you going to do? You know? And I feel like that's, for me, psychologically, like looked at that question through this new lens, found it to be very powerful, because you're facing a difficult situation. It's a social situation. There's some competing forces. You're not exactly sure what to do. There's temptation to do certain things or to act in a certain way, you know? But if you ask yourself, what would Jesus do? It can really help provide a guide of how to behave, you know? And sometimes it's like a really difficult question to answer. Like it's not exactly clear what the best person would do, you know, or somebody without sin would do. But usually it's pretty clear what they wouldn't do.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's enough, you know? Like I'm not going to act this way because clearly that's not what he would do, you know?
Right.
And yeah, I found that pretty cool.
Yeah, I think you're bringing up hints of what the role of the Holy Spirit is. Because if you look at the Trinity, the way I describe it to people is it's kind of like water. There's, you could have water, you could have ice, you could have steam, but, the main common denominator is that it's water. So, Jesus came and has his own specific job that he did and is doing. And then you have the Holy Spirit, which is doing its own job. And then you have God who's doing his own job. And even when, I forget when it was, but I think it was before he was crucified, he said he was going to give us the gift of the Holy Spirit. And because his disciples were, upset, like, Jesus, you can't leave us. Like, what are you doing? And he said, don't worry, like, I will be with you in the form of the Holy Spirit. So I haven't studied other religions like Buddhism. I know there are a lot of religions that believe in karma, and there's actually, I was talking to my one friend, and I think she said in Eastern Orthodox religions like Christianity, karma was a thing too. It's just that was removed somewhere along the line. So it's interesting, like, to identify what your inner guide is. And talking about literature, The Alchemist, that's why The Alchemist is like, has been translated into like 25 or something different languages. And I never read that either until recently. And I could see why that was such a profound book for so many, because it's identifying like your personal legend and your inner guide and your purpose. And in Christianity, like, God gives you your purpose, not just like, oh, what am I going to do vocationally, but also like your purpose for the common good and humanity,
Yeah. I like the symbolism with Christianity around like walking in Christ's footsteps. I think that's really powerful symbolism, because you still have to walk the path. It's still you that has to go down the path, but there's like an infinite number of paths that you can follow, like the one that you're trying to follow is the one of like the hero, the person who values truth and values love and self-sacrifices for the ultimate good. Like walk in that person's footsteps and aim to be like that person, especially when you're uncertain of how to operate,
Yeah.
You can always come back to that as like your new aim, as like what you're aiming for,
Right. Yeah. And that is a really good point. And I think where the disconnect is with humanity is the brokenness, and people are only trying to meet their needs, so we're like, how is there, like, I don't know, like stealing and murder and whatever, like, well, maybe that person did a robbery so that he could get money to pay for his daughter's medical bills. Like, but then also sometimes people are, I don't know, they just steal because for whatever reason, like, you can't take things for face value. Like, there's always a motive there. And it's so hard.
Yeah. And ultimately, you can't control what other people can do.
Right.
You know, you can only control what you do and like what your moral character is, and having dignity of character.
Yeah.
Because if you lose that, like, you don't really have anything. You know? I have an interpretation of the Holy Spirit, or the Trinity, I should say.
Okay.
If you want to hear it a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's been a little bit since I talked about this. Let me see if I can get it right. I almost like to draw a picture of it, you know? So you draw like the cross, you know?
Yeah.
And you have like that center point there, you know? And you can also think of like the horizontal axis as like time.
Okay.
You know? So everything like, okay, so that point in the middle is like right now. The present moment, right now. And that is symbolic of the Holy Spirit.
Okay.
So what that's kind of trying to tell you what to do is like, be the hero right now. Like, focus on right now, do the best you can right now, you know? So, and then God the Father is looking backwards in time. So that is like culture. It's like everything, the sum of everything that led to this point in time, you know? So there's lots of like really good things in there, but there's also some bad things in there, you know? So we have to have like respect for everything that we've been handed. Like the road that you traveled on to get where you're at, like, wasn't built by you. Like the home that you're in, it wasn't built by you. Like the foundation of like cumulative knowledge of society wasn't built by you, you know? Oh no, you froze again.
I see my little thing's green. Oh yeah, it says we could not connect to your selected camera. Please select a different camera or try restarting. I wonder if I switch to like my front camera and then if I switch back and forth. Did that change anything?
You're just not visible. Oh, you're back.
Okay.
All right, cool. So we'll just keep rolling. It's basically the past. It's a sum of all of the past. And if you think about the past, there's like heroes in the past that have given their lives so we can have what we have, you know?
Yeah.
And we owe some respect to them. And then if you look at before I move on from that, like the past is mostly order. It's mostly like well-defined. Like we know sort of what happened. There's some uncertainty in there, so there exists like some chaos in there. So it's like it's a lot like the yin yang symbol, you know? Within order, some chaos that could emerge, you know? Yeah. And then you look at the future, and that's like the other side of the right side of the Trinity graph, you know?
Yeah.
That's the future. It's God the Son. It's like the vulnerable, helpless future that needs you, the hero, right now. Because if you don't do it's chaotic.
Right.
Like, we know what's going to be in the future. Like we have some idea, so there's like some order in the future.
Right.
But it's like mostly chaotic because it's not entirely predictable, you know? So it's kind of like this balance that we have to kind of continually keep of like having respect for the past and everything that we've inherited, while also not thinking that everything we've inherited is good. Like having a critical eye that like, because the past is blind and dead. It can't see today what we have, you know? Just like the Egyptian god, I think it was Osiris. I think it was Osiris. Was blind, willfully blind, and was eventually dead, you know?
God.
It took the hero in the present to like revivify that spirit so future could be better off, you know?
Okay.
So yeah, that's kind of my interpretation of it. It's like kind of this past, present, future balance that we have to strike.
So interesting. Have you ever watched the comedy skits by Joe Rogan?
I love Joe Rogan. He's a hero of mine. He's one of the reasons I have this podcast.
Nice. I forget which comedy skit it was. I think it was his second one. I forget what it's called. It might be Triggered or something. And he's like, if George Washington came to today, he'd be like, you didn't rewrite that shit? He's like, I wrote that with a feather.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh my God, that's so true. Like what? People, oh God, they're just like so afraid of change. Like, okay, like when that Constitution was written, maybe people didn't know how it was going to go, but they recognized something needed to be put in order. Why can't we take that same responsibility and own up to something needs to change and do it?
Yes.
For the future, like you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it goes back to like these other religious stories, like the Egyptian, I don't know if you're familiar with like the Egyptian stories of like Osiris and Isis and Set and Horus and like their.
No, I'm not.
But it's basically similar to what we're talking about here. It's like there's this constant need for revival and
evolution, like keep moving forward.
Right. Without that process, like we end up like living on the corpse of our ancestors, but not actually like doing anything that's sustainable, you know? Because eventually, if you're just living on like the corpse of your ancestors, if you're living on like your existing culture and not making up changes, like, well, our culture's great, America's the best, and it's always been the best, and like it doesn't mean anything. It's like you're wrong. We need to update shit. You know, we need to look critically. Even if like 99% of it is good, we still need to look at that 1% that's not good and figure out how to make it better. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Which is why I believe that through pop culture and psychological warfare, people are trying to absolve critical thinking. Like, you know, I grew up in this country believing we are the best country in the world because that is the rhetoric that is fed to me.
Right.
You know, and oh man, like, I don't know at what point I was stopped and I was like, wait, other countries seem to be doing fine. Like, Finland, I mean, they seem to still be working. So what's the deal?
And even if we're definitively the best country in the world by far, it doesn't mean we're perfect. It doesn't mean we have things to change and update and improve on, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like I started watching Michael Jordan's new documentary series that came out, you know, and
what's that about?
It focuses on his last year with the Bulls because there's a lot of like behind the scenes, I'll say like political, but it's more like whatever. But you get a lot of like you get a lot of snapshots of his kind of like history too, you know.
Okay.
And like if he said as a high school basketball player that like I'm the best basketball player to ever live, and like didn't try to get better, he never would have been one of the best basketball players to ever live, you know. But because like he knew he was good, like he knew he could be better, he knew he could continually get better, and he did. He rapidly got better, you know. And
wow.
So it's like this balance between like self-belief. Like we need to believe that like. Forget about America for a second. Just like focus on you as an individual. You need to believe that you're a good person and that like maybe you're a great person. But you also need to believe that like there's things about you that could be improved and you could be better. And the gap between where you are and where you could be is all of your untapped potential. Like face the reality that like you're not living up to your potential. So like accept that, you know. But you're never going to get better if you can't face that reality, you know?
Right. And as you're talking, you're reminding me of, who is it? I think it's hold on, let me Google it real quick because I don't want to like mess it up. Okay. So it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Correct.
Like
I wrote that here too. Because when you were talking about the needs thing earlier,
Yeah, like when your most basic needs aren't met, like I've even experienced this in my own life, like obviously trying to like wade through adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
If your basic needs aren't met, like, which in the triangle, the most basic needs are your psychological needs, like
But it goes like
air, food, water, like stuff like that.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we can't get to, like you said, self-actualization, which is the highest, but like you can't even achieve expanding your abstract mind until those basic needs are met, like food, shelter, and then from there you go to safety. Yes. And then you go to those abstract things like love and whatever.
Yes.
And so like, you know, there are still places in America where children aren't eating. Like 1 in 4 children are starving in America, you know, so don't tell me for 1 second that, you know, we're the best country. Like, I'm sorry. No.
Right. And like I said, even if we were,
it
doesn't mean that even like Michael Jordan in 1993, even if he was the best basketball player at that time to ever live, he still got better. He still like worked on his game, and he still like worked to improve, you know?
Yeah.
We're just going to quit because we're the best, you know? We don't
Yeah.
work anything because we're the best, you know?
Right.
It's like, how about getting better? How about helping your teammates, you know?
Right. Yeah. Like some
thing too comes into play when it comes to like environmental things too, because I read somewhere that like once like a family makes more than like $30,000 a year, like statistically they start to care about the environment.
Interesting.
So if like you're poor and you're struggling day to day, like you don't really have any extra resources to like save for the future.
Oh God, yeah. Right.
Like you're like, oh, like I'm actually pretty stable here and like everything's kind of all right. Like maybe it would be good if I saved some of my resources to protect like my children's future, you know? So it's important to like get most people past that point of not worrying about their immediate needs so they can start planning for the future and start reflecting inwardly and like start, you know, working on improving, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Huh.
I want to go back to this book, The Alchemist, too, because that book had like a really profound impact on my life, I think, a little bit.
Oh,
you know?
Did it? I'm so interested. Tell me, because it didn't have any profound impact on me.
Well, you know, I thought the ending was really weird, and I kind of didn't really. The ending kind of threw me.
Okay.
So no spoilers. We're not going to say how it ends or whatever. But I think the part specifically that like really resonated with me is like when the main character, I forget his name, has the realization that like he could always go back to being a shepherd. He's like, oh, like what if I give all this up and I go do this other thing and like it doesn't work out? He's like, well, I could always go back to being a shepherd. And he's like, oh yeah, I could. That's right. I forgot. You know? And it's like with that understanding, like opens up a whole new world of like risks you're willing to take to get better. You know? Like Michael Jordan going to play baseball. It's like whatever.
Yeah.
Like I could always go back to playing basketball. You know, I could always go back to, and same thing happened with me when I decided to go hike the Appalachian Trail. You know, I could always go back to being an energy consultant and working in solar and doing all of that, you know, and like I'm currently in the process of like realizing that's easier said than done, but it's still like it's going to happen, you know, especially if I want it to happen and I believe believe it to happen and I keep working at it, you know. And without that, people are afraid to take those risks. If you're afraid you're going to lose everything, then you're not going to take those risks, you know?
Oh, absolutely.
And confidence that you can get them back, you can do something with that.
I think that's the privilege of our generation, though, like our generation and our parents' generation. That's the privilege of it. And I was actually just talking to my mom about that the other day because I was telling her, like, there's just so much pressure put on, like, our generation to go to college, get the job, build into the 401k, get the house. Like, first of all, where did that rhetoric come from? Second of all, why does that have to be true for me? But I think that's what, generational trauma is. You look at our grandparents and our great grandparents and what they went through. And that's why that rhetoric's been passed down, because they didn't have the luxuries of saying, oh, I can go back to this shop. No, you're not guaranteed a freaking job.
Yeah.
So it's so hard, because I was talking to someone actually last night who's struggling with those same things about where he wants to go vocationally. His inner guide is telling him it's not where he's at right now, and he doesn't know where he wants to go, where he wants to work, blah, blah, blah. Like, he went to college, he graduated with 3 degrees. Like, what? And so he understands like the enormous privilege he has with that. And he's just recognizing like, I'm not happy right now. And I was even telling him, I was like, listen, because he's like, oh, maybe I'm supposed to do this. Like, maybe I'm meant for this. And I said, listen, maybe you are, but in our lifetime, that maybe could change 10 times over. I said, right now in the present, just meditate on what feels true for you, like right now, because that is like your path. And I think in The Alchemist, that's something similar what he did. Like, he lived with some tea glass crystal maker for like a year, because that was like what was true for him in that moment to get him to his goal. And another part of the issue is like in our generation, we aren't, I don't think we're really encouraged to be individuals in a sense. Like, that whole rhetoric of go to college, get the job, get the house, that is so arbitrary and such a blanket rhetoric. Like, that doesn't really speak to anyone, like that doesn't feed your soul. Right. So, I left my career because I didn't really have any goals. Like, I did all of that. Like, I was successful for like someone my age, and that's exactly what he's feeling. Like, he's super successful for where he's at. He's not even 25, and he's just not happy. And because it's like this blanket rhetoric that isn't feeding anyone. Like, what does getting the job, going to college, getting the house, what does that do? What that actually says is you're more concerned about safety. You're more concerned about like so many things that I could see were important to our grandparents or our great grandparents that honestly we're not really concerned with now. Because like, if you look at the statistics, what is it like? First of all, people are getting married a lot later in life, 31, 32, 33, having kids a lot later than what used to be when you were 15, 16.
Yeah.
Like, things are shifting. So like, obviously the rhetoric has to change also.
Yeah. And I think part of it is our parents are looking out for us. They want us to do well. They also partially probably a little bit selfish too. Like, they don't want to have to be financially responsible for us. Yeah. So like, by encouraging us to get it, build a foundation of education and get a career and stick with it, like, it's pretty safe. Like, if you do that, they're never going to have to like bail you out of financial debt or something, and that's a good thing,
Well, yeah. And it's so much easier. Like, as I'm learning, like, I always had my own IRA, for example. Like, I was never tied to a job. Like, I've always had my own independent retirement account, blah, blah, blah. But to like achieve security in benefits like health, dental, vision, obviously I need all 3. It is so much more expensive to do that independently than, go through a corporation or a job. And that frustrates me because I just feel like that's one more aspect of control. Like,
Totally.
let's make it harder for you to be independent and an individual,
And that's one reason that I'm for like the healthcare plans that people like Bernie Sanders have put forward.
Mm-hmm.
Not only do I think that like A, we can afford to take care of people, and B,
Mm-hmm.
that we should do that because it saves us more in the end and is the right thing to do, but more so from like a entrepreneurial economic perspective. Like it's like crazy that like my employer has to like bear that responsibility.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
my desire to leave that place is like sort of there's an extra incentive not to leave, to not take to start my own business or start my own job or to like do whatever, because
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to lose my health care. And like, God forbid if I had like kids to take care of or anything like that, like you're not going to leave. You're going to stay with the safer thing,
Mm-hmm.
like there's benefits in taking the safer route. Like I don't want to sit here and pretend
Sure.
like there's no benefit to it,
Mm-hmm.
but there's also no risk without reward, or no reward without risk, I should say,
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of like a trap. And of all of the reasons to be for Medicare for all, I think that's like a really important reason,
Mm-hmm. 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 I know it's so hard because there's pros and cons to everything, and is it Canada that has like
healthcare.
yeah, and the one excuse I hear all the time is, well, guess what? You're going to be number 870 if you need a heart transplant. And so I'm like, okay, I understand that, but can't we just rework something? Like, like, why does it have to be like so cut and dry in that way?
Yeah.
Like, oh, well, if you're going to sacrifice that, guess what? You're going to sacrifice the number on your waiting list, Yeah.
And it's also like a gross oversimplification too,
Right. Yeah.
Like to like use that as a way to simplify it and basically like straw man,
Yeah.
which is easily defeated. But instead, like if you look at it a little bit more, if you look at the complexity of it a little bit more, you could see that, okay, if we create a public funding pool for healthcare and it's not sufficient, well, then we need to create a bigger funding pool. Like the answer isn't like, oh, well, this sucks. Like, can't do this. It's like, no, like, and figure out a way to invest in this better. Whether that means putting more money in the pot, whether that means creating incentives for people to go to school for nursing and to become medical doctors, like adjust the things to make it better. Don't just like say it's impossible or that you're screwed,
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Kind of like a nihilistic, helpless sort of mentality that like I just can't relate to, like,
Yeah, that's definitely like just like reactionary and kind of like infantile, like just throw it all away. I feel like it,
Yeah. And it's also too like, okay, so we can be critical of Canada's system, for example,
Yeah.
Like our system's not perfect. People get denied health coverage all the time. People pay a lot of money for their prescription drugs. People are in mountains of debt because they have medical bills and they don't have adequate health insurance. Like these aren't good things.
Yeah, exactly.
If our system was perfect and working perfectly, then like I wouldn't want to change it either,
Right.
But the reality is it's not. And like it works better for rich people, of course, What about everybody else?
Like I heard once, cash is king.
Yeah.
And I worked for it was a geriatric service agency where we provided caregivers to like anyone over the age of, I think, like to be considered an adult, it was like in the healthcare system or something, it was 22 or 21 or 22. So if you needed a caregiver, we were the ones to provide it. And in Pennsylvania, the health insurance stipulations, like, and I saw it in the office, like, it's called waiver. So if you got if you were through the state insurance, you were on the waiver form, which means the government paid for your services through us, or you were private pay, which that was a smaller margin of clients than waiver. And I would go out to homes and I would do like the admission packet, like assess the needs of the client, what type of caregiver did they need, things like that. And let's say, oh God, like let's say there is a client that didn't have a car, was bedbound. They didn't have a wheelchair because their government wheelchair broke, but because it's through the government, they weren't eligible to receive a new wheelchair for 2 years. So this is a true story. Like that man was stuck in his bed unless, and he didn't need to be, like, that's like a freaking human rights issue to me. But we were the caregiver agency. Also, there are social workers through the state. And their hands are tied because it's these government policies. And, you know, if that was a private pay individual, they'd get the bells and whistles because they're paying the company cash.
Right.
And that's capitalism. You know what I mean? Like that is the reality of the situation. But why does it have to be reality?
Yeah, and it's really tricky because it comes down to like balance too. Like whoever made that policy about, okay, you can't get a new wheelchair for 5 years or whatever the set was, and this guy had 3 years and it breaks. You know, it's like, oh well, you got to wait 2 years. Well, it's like, okay, well this policy was created for a good reason, right? They don't want people getting a new wheelchair every year just because that they can and like selling the old one on eBay and like cash. Like, you know, they're trying to prevent fraud essentially. You know. Yeah. But like, where is like the adjustment? Like, like where's the understanding of that? Like, okay, this person isn't selling their wheelchair on the internet. They're not like their wheelchair is damaged and doesn't work, or they were in an accident or somebody damaged it or whatever, and like how they don't have one. Yeah. So like, what are we gonna do about that? Are we just really gonna make them wait and like basically accuse them of a crime? That's what you're doing. Basically, you're saying like, no, you did something illegal, and that's why your wheelchair doesn't work anymore. It's like, well, I didn't do anything illegal. I was broke, it was faulty, whatever. And like, I need a new one, you know?
Yeah.
So being able to deal with that, and like, what's challenging is there's so many people that we try to create these like blanket policies to deal with everybody, but they don't adequately deal with everybody. People have different circumstances or whatever, you know? It could have been something as simple as like the route that guy had to travel in his wheelchair wasn't smooth, like it was rickety, you know, or like the wheelchair took more damage more frequently and therefore down quicker. No fault of his own. Like, what is he supposed to do? You know what I mean?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah.
People have this mentality that people are trying to take advantage of the system. You know, I think there's some truth to it. Like some people do. You know, I'm not going to pretend like that's not what's happening in some cases. You know.
Oh God, yeah. Like I worked for this children's agency. Actually, like when I first graduated from college, like my whole goal all along, like I wanted to work for children. You know, like they are so underrepresented. You know, they needed a voice. Like they needed an advocate. And like I was very passionate about it. And so I worked for an agency. I was a classroom therapist in an alternative school. So in a classroom, there was a teacher, a teacher's aide, and myself, a classroom therapist. And this was a school where the desks were like bolted to the floor so that they couldn't be thrown at me.
Wow.
I loved it because I saw these kids as just a replication of what was modeled for them, you know, and I had to go. There's a psychiatrist in the school. These children have, you know, either experienced like severe trauma in their younger years, and so they're on like these psychotropic medications. And this alternative school was the step before they are able to go back to mainstream school. So in this classroom, they're supposed to be developing like these anger replacement, like therapeutic techniques, and, these cognitive behavioral, like therapy techniques so they can control their behavior. And I'm going to these med checks with the student, their parents, and the psychiatrist. And there are parents out there that are purposely not giving their children their medications to continue their behaviors so that they stay in the system because those parents get more money. I've seen parents that overdose their children on one certain type of medication. It's in the blood work. The psychiatrist saw it. And I feel like I was one of the only classroom therapists at the time to really child line. Like, I had more social workers from children and youth coming to my classroom than I saw in other classrooms. And there was one instance, I was in an interview with an upper level therapist where they have their master's degree, blah, blah, blah. I'm underneath them. I put a child line in. The social worker was investigating, and I was giving statements. The upper level therapist kept quiet the whole time. And I'm like, come on, like, this is what's wrong. Like, are you seriously going to just sit here when you have talked to this child? You've seen the type of people that have come in here claiming that they're guardians over the child. Like, what in the world? There were so many days where, like, driving home, I was just like crying. I felt like just so defeated, and it's sad that those are the type of people that just stigmatize the whole system, that was built. And it's like you said, like, something has to be adjusted. Something's not working. Why is it that parents are pushing for their children to have an autism diagnosis because they get a government check? Well, why aren't they getting enough income to be able to support their children? Do they have a job? Why aren't they able to get a job? You know what I mean? So it's hard.
It's really hard. And I don't have like a solution.
I know, right?
I don't know what to do, and that's a difficult spot to be in, that you're faced with these complex problems, and like there's all sorts of things you can try and you can do, but who knows what's going to work.
Yeah.
It's
right.
Tricky.
And it was hard because I felt guilty. Like, I felt guilty for a number of reasons. Like, first of all, I had the privilege to go to college, number one. So I felt guilty that I have this college education with this counseling degree that I just simply don't want to use anymore.
Yeah.
In that, like, literal sense. And I also felt guilty that, I don't know, maybe I wasn't, like, mentally or emotionally strong enough to just, like, stick it out like I thought I was.
Yeah.
And then I had a conversation with a mutual friend. He was a supervisor in some organization. And, like, through conversation, I guess he saw, like, I have a good head on my shoulders, I'm not dumb, whatever. And so he said to me, he's like, well, can't that motivate you to, like, finish your master's, to be a good supervisor and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, no, it's not, because at the end of the day, like, you're still answering to somebody. Like, when I was at that agency, I was brought in to the psychiatrist, and he, like, reamed me out one day because I was essentially saying this child did not need to be in our program anymore. And he was reaming me out. Well, his perspective is like, I'm not a doctor. And I'm like, no, but I also monitor the child's behavior 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. Monday to Friday. And based off of my notes that you clearly don't ever care to look at, he doesn't need to be here. So, and at our agency, like that school I was at was the money pot. They were charging those children's insurance companies like through the roof. Like, I don't even know how much. And so obviously, like if I'm saying a student doesn't, that was a 9-month rehabilitation program, and they had children there since kindergarten, and I was a 6th and 7th grade classroom therapist. So my issue is I just get too wrapped up in administration, and like I can't not see like what's going on. Like if I see what's going on, like I'm going to try to say something or do something about it. And I'm not the type of person that's just like, God, I try to like tell myself every day, like, you know, like that one book, The Freedom Riders, like she couldn't change the economy, obviously, of poverty, but what she did was she influenced those kids when she could. And maybe I could return to it now because I'm like a little older, a little wiser.
Yeah.
But it's just so hard.
I'm not going to sit here and tell you what to do, but it seems like you were probably helping those kids a lot. So if you can find yourself back into a position, even if it's not perfect, and try to make the best of it, I think you'd probably benefit, and the kids would definitely benefit, And it's always a challenge, like no matter what position you're in, of like dealing with authority when you don't see eye to eye. I struggle with that too,
Right?
For sure, struggle with that. And there's no real easy answer other than just like doing your best to express yourself as clearly and concisely and calmly as you can, and like explain why you feel it the way you feel. And if they want to be corrupt and take the money and run, well, that's on them. You can't control what they do, but you can still say like you can still speak your mind and try to make the best of it.
Yeah, that's a good point too.
What else here? Want to hit one more thing here before we wrap it up? I think we're probably pretty close to the 2-hour mark here.
Oh, is that the time?
Yeah, I try to do about 2 hours or.
Oh, nice.
So. Anything else that you want to get into, or questions, or any of that stuff?
I don't know. We hit on a lot of good things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. I can't really think of anything. We hit a lot of like the topics that you avoid at the dinner table, so that's good.
Yeah, I think that itself is completely a flawed strategy. Like, we're not going to talk about politics or religion with our family. Well,
right?
Who's going to talk about it? These things are like fundamental to society, and we're just going to ignore them because they're difficult. It's like, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't. Often the most difficult things are the most rewarding, and
it's so true.
Like in the story of what is it, like I think it's King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table.
I love that story.
They head out in search of the Holy Grail, and they're instructed to enter the forest at the place where it's darkest to them.
Wow.
And like
so metaphorical.
Yeah, the things that we need most are hidden where we least want to look. And by engaging in those difficult things, whether it's psychological or social, political or physical, like you get better. Your whatever journey you're on, it needs to start there.
Absolutely. Yeah. I guess I want to end with this, that like we talked a lot about religion, and I'm not sure if I painted a positive light per se, but if anybody is wondering, curious, whatever, I always hope to be just like a approachable person, But if anybody is like turned off to religion or Christianity specifically for whatever reason, like I just want to encourage them that at the end of the day, we are human beings. And yes, like priests, preachers, they should be held to a higher moral standard. And I do agree about that. And at the end of the day, I just want to encourage people to just be more open and a little more compassionate, that like people are people too. And yes, there's a lot of scandals in the church, whatever have you. But it's also, unfortunately, just sometimes our reality. And even God talks about that too, about how we are just imperfect people. And yes, we are striving to follow Christ and be more Christ-like, but we aren't Christ and we're not perfect. And just having that understanding and that premise makes the journey more easy. Because myself, I just get caught up on more like the theology of things and the presentation of some things. Like in Christianity, like gender roles, like they're not inherently evil. It's just what I experienced was the presentation of it that hurt me, you know, like, so it's kind of, you know, just keep a critical eye, just be a little open and talk about it. Just talk about it.
Yeah. And I would add on to that, like if anybody's in a position where their life's not perfect, well, first of all, nobody's life's perfect, but especially if you're dealing with some sort of internal struggle or you feel kind of lost, like I feel like these stories have ancient wisdom built into them that you can actually tap into if you look at them with an open mind, right?
Yeah.
And a critical eye too, not just like accepting everything that you read and taking it all for literal truth, but if you kind of combine this effort of like having an open mind and a critical eye, like imagining that these stories have something to teach you, that you can get a lot out of them.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. That's why, like, if you look at AA, that was fundamentally Christian.
Yep.
Like based off of that, but I forget who wrote it, but they had enough insight to just say, what is your higher power? You know, like they didn't say God is the higher power, although like a lot of people do gravitate towards that. But like, just so many, like the Red Cross, like just so many great things have been like fundamentally stemmed from like Christianity, you know, and like you said, there is truth to a lot of like ancient stories. Like there is wisdom there. So at least if you don't want to like identify with a religion, that's fine. Like you're on your own journey, whatever. But if you're striving to build your character, then definitely like there's some, like, I don't want to say like, no, Christianity is not real, because I respect the fact that why has this lasted thousands of years, and how has this spread from like, you know, the Sea of Gilead or Galilee, the Sea of Galilee to everywhere else in the world? Like, how is that, you know? So there's something there to, like you said, respect. Definitely.
Awesome. Well, it was a pleasure speaking with you, Ellen. Thank you for taking the time. Super grateful. Very much enjoyed it. And just thankful that you came on and talked with me.
Yeah, it was so great connecting with you too. I was like curious where this was going to go, and I'm so happy I did it.
Me too. Thank you so much. And keep in touch with me, all right? And send your family some love, all right?
Definitely. Can't wait to tell Chris that what we were talking about for 2 hours.
Yeah, I hope he watches it. You better watch this, Chris.
Right.
All right. Take care of yourself.
All right. Bye, Jordan.
Bye-bye.